Welcome everyone. We are live with another episode of Level Up Law, where every Tuesday at noon, South Carolina Legal Services is leveling up your legal knowledge about an area of law that we practice in. I'm Senior Staff Attorney Susan Ingalls, and I'm here with our producer, Kenneth Elliott from our IT department. And you are viewing live Attorney Mary Goff from our office in Charleston, South Carolina. Today, we're really excited to have a discussion of the work that our Migrant Unit does, which Mary heads up. We are observing Hispanic Heritage Month right now, which you may have noticed if you follow us on social media. But before we get started with learning more about how our Migrant Unit is cultivating access to justice for South Carolina migrant farm workers, I do want to remind everyone there's not going to be any legal advice in this presentation. It's really just general information for the public about the great work that our Migrant Unit is doing. However, if you do need the help of a lawyer for any type of topic that we handle, do call our intake line here at South Carolina Legal Services or apply online. Also, our Migrant Unit has a special way of applying for those services, and Mary will be sharing that with you in her presentation today. I also want to remind everybody that all of our episodes of Level Up Law are posted by our producer, Kenneth Elliott, to the Level Up Law playlist on our YouTube channel, usually within about 24 hours. And so you'll be able to find this presentation there as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Migrant Unit and the head of the Migrant Unit at South Carolina Legal Services, Attorney Mary Goff. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm happy to be here. And today we are going to talk about how we're going to be cultivating access to justice for South Carolina's migrant farm workers. As she said, my name is Mary Goff. I'm the staff attorney here with the Migrant Unit. So I'm going to give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about who we are, who we serve. I want to tell you a little bit about the H-2A visa program because that is the bulk of the individuals that we serve. I'm going to tell you about H-2A visa holder rights and then what the Migrant Unit does on behalf of them and how to apply for our services. So who are we? Well, the Migrant Unit is a division of the South Carolina Legal Services Group at large. South Carolina Legal Services is a nonprofit law firm that provides free legal assistance to eligible low-income residents throughout the whole state of South Carolina. The mission is that all South Carolinians will have full and fair access to justice. So within that, the Migrant Unit is a special little place. It is comprised of me, Mary Goff, and an outreach paralegal, Dulce Lopez. The two of us essentially make up the program. We are both bilingual and we conduct much of our outreach in Spanish and much of our client contact takes place in Spanish, but we also both speak English and we do all of the business side of things in English. The Migrant Unit also is supervised by Attorney Angela Myers. And then a big thank you to all of the other SCLS attorneys who have stepped in and helped from time to time when the Migrant Unit has overflow needs or just to lend a helping hand and participate. So we really appreciate the organization at large, all the help that everyone provides. So the SCLS organization has all of these offices statewide, and the Migrant Unit is actually housed here in Charleston, but we cover the entire state and we do a lot of traveling. What is the specific goal of the Migrant Unit? Well, we want to cultivate access to justice for South Carolina's migrant farm workers, and we do this through educational outreach and then also by providing quality legal work that addresses the most compelling legal needs of migrant farm workers. So now that you know who we are, who do we serve? Well, we serve H-2A and H-2B visa holders who are agricultural workers and non-agricultural workers. We also folded in that serve victims of crime and labor trafficking. And then we can also technically assist domestic seasonal farm workers, although the bulk of our work ends up being for H-2A workers. And one of the requirements to receive services at SCLS is that they meet certain eligibility components. This is true for any client applying, including migrant farm workers. So we are an LSC funded organization, and that means that the income requirements must be under 125% of the federal poverty level. I've included a chart here because it's a lot easier to get a visual of that. And I think I would like for you to focus on the number for one individual, because a lot of the farm workers that we serve end up being single young men. So an individual can have a maximum of $16,988 a year earnings. And this number will make a little more sense when we talk about some other numbers later in the presentation. But any individual under that is going to receive our services. And also we can get waivers for individuals who are between 125% of the federal poverty level and 200% of the federal poverty level. But most of the time for the migrant farm workers, that isn't coming up. There are other eligibility requirements, including assets limits. That doesn't really ever come up in a migrant farm worker case. And then legal issues, so we have only certain types of cases that we can handle. And then there are certain citizenship requirements, but a farm worker with a visa does meet those citizenship requirements. Now that you know about eligibility, I wanted to tell you a little more about the H-2A program itself, and I'm going to spend the most time today on this because this is sort of unknown to a lot of people, and it is sort of the linchpin of why the Migrant Unit even exists. So the temporary guest workers is how the H-2A program came to its current iteration. The program originally started out as the Braceros program around World War II, and that was because of a domestic labor shortage. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act turned that Braceros program from sort of a free-for-all into H-2 visas for unskilled workers. And then in 1986, the H-2 program was subdivided into H-2A, which is for agricultural workers, and then H-2B for non-agricultural workers. But all of these are temporary guest workers, and all of this program is because there is ongoing labor shortages in the United States since World War II. The purpose of the H-2A legislation is actually designed to protect U.S. workers, domestic workers. So it's designed to mean that U.S. workers, rather than someone from a foreign national, would be coming in, so that U.S. workers get the job and not someone else. And it's also designed to keep a floor on wages, so that the bringing in of foreign workers doesn't adversely dip the wages too low, affecting U.S. workers. So those are the two main purposes of the program. Many people wonder, how does this even work? So I'm just going to give you sort of a glimpse of it. It's not very technical, but what happens is the Department of Labor certifies that a labor shortage exists, and this has to be specific, has to be within a certain industry and a certain geographic location. And then once that certification happens, the employer will send a list of names of workers that they need to be hired. And then they send that list down to, I'm going to use Mexico because this is where the majority of the workers that we see in South Carolina are from Mexico. So the list goes down to the U.S. consulate in Mexico, and the workers at the U.S. consulate interview these potential workers, and then they issue the visas. Once the visa is issued, remember this visa is tied to employment, so it's considered employment-based sponsorship. The positions are up to a maximum of 10 months, and they are certified by the Department of Labor. So this is not an undocumented immigrant. This is a visa holder legitimately present within the United States, fully authorized to be here under the terms of the Department of Labor certification or clearance order. And the clearance order itself serves as a contract, and it includes a bunch of different information, such as wages, the hours that they would be working, the duration, meaning from what day and month to what day and month the contract is supposed to last. It talks about which crops they would be harvesting or what the nature of the work is that they will be doing, their housing locations, and then also how their meals are going to be delivered. So this contract itself has a lot of information in it. Let me give you some numbers about the H-2A program itself. These numbers come from the USDA Economic Research Service Bulletin, which was issued in August of 2022, and the numbers lag behind 2 years. So these numbers are going back to 2020. But just to give you an example of how much this program is growing, in fiscal year 2010, there were 75,000 H-2A worker spots that were certified by the Department of Labor. And flash forward 10 years to fiscal year 2020, and there were 275,000 certifications. So huge volume increase, and that number just continues to increase. So I don't have the exact numbers for 2022, but they're higher than 275,000. And just to look at some national averages, an H-2A contract offers nationally the following: 24 weeks. So although it can be certified for up to 10 months, it's usually going to be around 24 weeks, which coincides with the typical growing season. Averages 39 hours or so per week. The average wage is $13 an hour, and the average contract was worth $12,500. That number, this is why I was emphasizing the 125% of the federal poverty level earlier. So an average H-2A worker under their contract is only going to make $12,500, which fits them squarely within the LSC eligibility guidelines for income. You may ask, well, if this is only a 24 to 40 week contract and there are other weeks out of the year, then maybe they have more income that would bump them over. But the reality is that the wages are so depressed in Mexico that it only amounts to a few $100s. It's not in the thousands. So if a worker, for example, worked from January to April in Mexico, and then they had their contract from April to September, the amount that they earn in Mexico on average is about $40 a week. So let that number sink in for a minute. But it doesn't end up pushing them over 125% of the federal poverty level, and we're usually able to serve them without even getting a waiver. Here are some more numbers, just because it's interesting by comparison and to get a grasp on who is present in South Carolina. But in fiscal year 2019, the South Carolina was in the top 10 states having the number of certified H-2A visa holders. In 2020, we are no longer in the top 10. We got inched out by Kentucky. But if you look at the pie graphs, South Carolina had 2.4% of the total H-2A certifications in the country. And in 2020, Kentucky had 2.5%. So we're still around 2.4%. Our number hasn't actually changed all that much. We remain steady near the top 10. And these charts down at the bottom show you the total number of positions certified. So if you look at the first column, fiscal year to date, down near the bottom, you can see that in fiscal year 2019, there were 257,000 plus certified. In 2020, as I've already mentioned, 275,000 plus certified, so that number just keeps inching up. And then it's also worth noting that it's done by quarter, but quarter 2 and 3 obviously have more laborers, H-2A visas issued or certified, because that's when the growing season is. So now that we know a little bit more about what the H-2A program is and why, I want to talk about the rights associated with being an H-2A visa holder. And before we talk about rights, I want us to recall that each of these H-2A visa holders is a person, and they are working hard, and their rights are derived from contracts and also from statute. But the reason the contracts and the statute exist is because it's essentially human rights that we are seeking to protect. So let's talk about what some of the protections are specific to the H-2A program. And we'll go into each of these in a little more detail. There's the right to disclosure, rights regarding wages, transportation, housing, workers' compensation, and then other additional provisions, which we will go into. What does disclosure mean? It just means that the H-2A visa holder has the right to be able to see the contract. And it's supposed to be given to them before they arrive, but no later than the first day of work. And it's supposed to be in a language that they can understand. So many of our H-2A workers are Spanish speakers. So technically they should be getting a copy of this Department of Labor certification in Spanish. I will say these are publicly available, so you can pull them up online just by plugging in into a Department of Labor website. It doesn't have the specific individuals' names though. Okay, so what about their rights to certain wages? So they have the right to be paid at least twice per week at the rate stated in the work contract, and we'll look at that just shortly. Their deductions are all supposed to be in writing. These are basic things that we are all accustomed to when we get our paychecks, and H-2A visa holders are no different. They have the right to these things. They're supposed to be able to receive an itemized written statement of their earnings. And then this is unique. They are guaranteed employment for at least 3/4 of the total hours promised in the work contract. So for example, we'll do some easy math. If their contract was 20 weeks, then they are guaranteed to get 15 out of those 20 weeks. That's the 3/4 guarantee. Now, what is their rate of pay? Well, there is a thing called the adverse effect wage rate. We call it AWR for short. And this is essentially the wage that is required to be paid to them. The law states that the H-2A visa holder is entitled to the higher of either the federal minimum wage, the state minimum wage, the collective bargaining rate, or the AWR, whichever is the highest. Well, in South Carolina, we don't have a state minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25, and we don't have a collective bargaining agreement. So the AWR is the rate that governs. Every worker should be getting paid at least, at a minimum, $11.99 an hour. This is true whether they are getting paid by the hour or if they are getting paid at piece rate. Even if they are paid at piece rate, it has to at least pan out to be at $11.99 an hour. It's worth noting, sadly, in a race to the bottom, that South Carolina and Alabama share the lowest AWR in the nation. Every other state, including neighboring North Carolina, have much higher minimum AWR for the H-2A visa holders. Now, switching from wages to transportation cost, these are the various transportation costs that the employer is required to pay on behalf of the H-2A visa holder. They're supposed to pay, reimburse, usually is how it happens, reimburse the worker for their travel all the way from their home city or town to their location in South Carolina. And that includes not only the travel expense, but also lodging and food. And this can be reimbursed once the worker has completed 50% of their contract. So there is a little bit built-in incentive for the worker to stay. So they have to complete 50% of it before they are reimbursed. But once they are done with the contract, if they have completed the terms of the contract, then the employer is also required to pay their return fees, their travel expenses. And then while they are here living, the employer is required to pay for their housing and required to pay for the transportation from the lodging to the farm, which sometimes can end up being quite lengthy. And most of the time, or ideally anyway, it's their housing is close to where they're working. But in some instances, the travel is an hour and a half, and the employer is required to provide that transportation. And it may go without saying, but the employer is also required to comply with all safety standards and have the vehicles properly insured, and the vehicles are to be operated by a licensed driver. I'll just tell you what we see, what I've eyeballed around the state is that many of the workers are transported in old school buses. A lot of them are painted white, but just take a generic school bus. That's what we see around the state as how they are generally getting from housing to the field. Now, let's talk about housing. The way the law states it is that if they can't return home the same day, then the employer is required to pay for their housing at no cost. If they've come from all the way from Mexico, obviously that's going to include them. So the employers provide housing for them, and the housing is required to meet certain safety standards typical of any South Carolina home, which, you know, be that what it is. And then included with the housing, the employer is either required to provide facilities for them to do their cooking, or they are supposed to provide them 3 meals and can only deduct a certain amount from the paycheck for those meals. Most of the time, again, anecdotally, but most of the time what you see is that they are providing kitchen facilities for the workers to use to prepare their own meals. So here are several other additional rights that an H-2A visa holder or temporary agricultural worker has once they are here in South Carolina. They're entitled to state workers' compensation. So if they get injured on the job, same analysis applies as it would to any other worker in South Carolina. We've already talked about housing. They're required to be supplied with all the tools they need to get the job done. They are also entitled to be free from discrimination or discharge for filing a complaint, testifying, or exercising their rights. In other words, free from retaliation. One way that retaliation comes up in the H-2A visa workers' rights arena is, for example, they've finished, they're working their contract, things have gone very badly, maybe they aren't getting paid the AWR, $11.99 an hour, or their hours are too long, or there's some complaint about their conditions, and they file a complaint with the Department of Labor, but it's nearing the end of their term, so they finish this term perfectly fine, but they don't get their name put back on the list to come back as an H-2A worker, and they haven't done anything wrong, they've simply filed a complaint. That is one instance where that could be retaliatory, and that worker would still be entitled to file some kind of retaliation claim if they are aware of their right and know who to access to get help with that right. The other situation that comes up is the labor trafficking. You know, when the employer takes immigration documents away or and their passport away. We will talk a little bit more about labor trafficking in just a few minutes. And then the employers are not allowed to charge recruitment fees and extra fees for the H-2A visa worker to actually get their visa. So now that we know who these people are and what kind of rights they have, well, what does the Migrant Unit do then on behalf of these people? So we're here to talk about the Migrant Unit cultivating access to justice. And I wanted to spend just a moment talking about, well, what does it even mean to access justice or to have access to justice? And access to justice is when a person with a legal issue has affordable and timely access to the level of legal help that they need in order to get a fair outcome. And it's an outcome that is fair, but also an outcome that feels fair. And this is a difficult thing to do because migrant farm workers in South Carolina are one of the most isolated groups that I have encountered in my years of public interest work. They face significant barriers to access to justice because they are isolated, because they are at the employer's mercy for everything. Imagine that you don't speak the language, you don't have any family or friends or community at large. The community is comprised of the other H-2A visa holders who are there in the same housing and doing the same work as you. And so without us coming and others around the state coming and meeting them and talking to them and making them aware of their rights, they are really, nobody sees these people really otherwise. It's not the same as a family who has integrated in the community, say in Charleston, the children are in school, much more integrated. This is very isolated and very unique. And so what the Migrant Unit is trying to do by cultivating access to justice, we are doing that two ways. One is through outreach and the other is through direct representation. So what is outreach? Outreach in this instance means that we go around the whole state finding the migrant farm workers where they live, and we teach them their rights, and we also show them where to get help. And I wanted to give you a couple of images of what this looks like. These are actual images we have taken while we've been out. We go out on dirt roads. We go very remote locations. Sometimes we encounter workers. We don't really access them when they're in the field. We are able to visit with them when they are in their homes. And when we do, we are able to talk to them and explain to them their rights and give them information that can help them learn a little bit more. The other way we can conduct outreach is through our social media efforts. So we continue to develop and maintain community partnerships because they also do outreach and they can let farm workers know about what we do. It's a very mutually beneficial thing to partner with our community members who are doing the similar type of work that we are doing. But we also maintain a social media presence, and we try to put content on there that is usually in Spanish and is focused on largely on farm worker rights, and then obviously where to get help once you know your rights and once you think that maybe your rights have been violated. So these are our QR codes. If you need them, you can go back and look at these slides later and find them there as well. But we try to keep our content updated, not daily, but with some regularity. In addition to outreach, we offer direct representation. And part of our direct representation, the bulk of our direct representation actually involves coordinating with federal, state, and local agencies such as DHS, SLED, SCDU, the EEOC, SCVAN, and all the other agencies around the state that are working to deliver justice. Particularly in regards to wage theft and then labor trafficking, we can refer those over to the Department of Labor, and then DHS picks up the labor trafficking cases. But we can also file direct suits as well on behalf of migrant farm workers whose rights have been violated. And some of the types of suits that we can take on include non-payment of wages, any of the contract violations. As I was telling you, the DOL certification serves sort of as a contract. So if the employer isn't living up to their end of the bargain, you could bring suit on those. Labor trafficking, we like to coordinate with other agencies on labor trafficking. But one of the things that we have found is that because they're an isolated community, and as is often the case with limited English proficient communities, the trust that we are able to build and the rapport we are able to build means that we need to be a go-between and a direct contact with the client, regardless of who else is working with them, because they like having access to someone they've actually seen in person and talked to. We can also bring cases on any of the housing and working conditions and pesticide exposure. I do want to take a minute to talk about labor trafficking because it does come up among agricultural workers. What is labor trafficking? Well, it's the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor. That's a very broad definition, but what we see, there are certain signs that indicate that there could be forced labor going on. One of the main telltale signs is when there's a confiscation of the passports, visa, or other documents. There's just no reason for an employer to confiscate those documents. These are adults coming, these are their documents. The employer sometimes will give a reason such as, oh, I can keep them safer than you can, but they have no right to do so, and there is no legitimate reason for an employer to be holding a worker's documents. We also see once they've confiscated the documents, then there can be threats and intimidation by an employer, but a lot of times it's not coming directly from the employer. It would be coming from some kind of supervisor who is out among the workers all the time and has a lot more power because they are among the workers, and then also a liaison reporting back to the supervisor. And then you see some other signs of labor trafficking you might see are when they have had to pay exorbitant recruiter fees and recruitment fees to get over here. So by the time they get here, they're in a lot of debt, and then they feel the need to suffer under horrible conditions because they have this debt they have to pay back. So that's a little bit about how labor trafficking can come about and the way it works. This is the main hotline that someone who needs help can call. It's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They offer text options, they offer live chat, they offer phone calls that you can make. And I wanted to just point out some statistics, or one statistic regarding domestic labor trafficking. This is in 2020. This data is in the United States in 2020. And agriculture is the second highest percentage of all the trafficking cases that we see, 7.8% of them are within the agricultural field. That's significant. And it's also just a good reminder of why we do the work we do, because again, some of the indicators, some of the things that make up the migrant, the H-2A visa holder, or the H-2B as well, visa holder community and life, are also some of the telltale signs that a trafficker will look for, because they're isolated, they don't have community, they report only to the employer. All the other things that I mentioned makes them especially vulnerable to trafficking. And it's not an issue of gender or race or anything else. It's simply, it happens across the boards. And these are young men typically that we're seeing, although there are women H-2A workers as well, but it's typically young men who are healthy and vibrant and talented and hardworking, and they can still fall prey to labor trafficking. So now that we know who we're serving, what their rights are, and what we can do, how would a person go about applying for our services? Well, the Migrant Unit has adapted our intake procedures to meet the needs of who we serve. So many of our H-2A clients and H-2B clients use WhatsApp. And so we have a WhatsApp line there where the clients and potential clients can make direct inquiries to us. They can send us text messages or call us, and we do our intakes ourselves. So at SCLS at large, there's a telephone intake line, and all cases go through the telephone intake line, except for these migrant cases, because they are unique and because we are a small unit. So if an individual wants to reach out for services, this is the best way to go about reaching us. And that concludes my presentation today. And I wanted to thank you for your time. I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of insight into what we do and why we do it, and especially an insight into who an H-2A visa holder is, why they're here, and what their rights are, and what they might need. Back to you, Susan.
Hey, thanks so much, Mary. I really appreciate excellent presentation, sharing with our viewers everything that our Migrant Unit staff does. It's so important for the migrant farm workers here in South Carolina. And hopefully, sharing this information today helps folks understand what the problems are that are out there, and of course, how our law firm at South Carolina Legal Services is working to address those problems. And you gave us some great insight into both of those. So also, I want to thank you, our audience. We do appreciate that you join us on Tuesdays, or if you're a regular watcher of our replays, we appreciate that too. So keep watching. And if you found this helpful, informative, useful, and you know it was going to be of value to others, please do go to our YouTube channel tomorrow at South Carolina Legal Services and like the broadcast, share it out to others. We want as many people as possible to get this important information about what we're doing to help the migrant farm workers here in our state. And while you're there, be sure to like and subscribe for more, and sign up for notifications so you'll get a notification each week when we post a new episode. And also, I do invite you to go check out the social media of our Migrant Unit and see what they're doing to reach the workers and the others who serve those farm workers in that way. And also, just a final word, be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Level Up Law. on Tuesday at noon. That will be a recorded Level Up Law by Holly Webster here in our Greenville office. She'll be talking about appealing eviction decisions that don't go your way. We'll all be at our statewide meeting in Myrtle Beach next week, working hard to get ready for another year of serving our communities in South Carolina. And so that one will be recorded, but it's going to be a great topic, as was the topic today. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks again to you, Mary. We appreciate everybody participating today. And that concludes today's webinar of Level Up Law. Take care, everybody.